Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third stop on our cross-Canada exploration in partnership with Edwin. Over the next few weeks, we are going to take you on 6 incredible virtual journeys across the country where we're meeting incredible scientists and conservationists who are protecting our wild places and animals. Of course, keep in mind, we've got our 7th bonus trip, our secret location, where we will go live in the field to wrap up our time together. So my name is Joe Grabowski, and I will be your host for this series. I run an organization called Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. We bring science, exploration, adventure, and conservation live to classrooms across Canada, across the US, and to places around the world. If you've never visited our site before, take a minute to visit exploringbytheseat.com. You can find all of the live events we have coming up, 30, 40, 50 free live events a month for classrooms to join from anywhere they want to. Okay, so I mentioned we are going to be meeting our speaker shortly, but before I do, I want to give a huge shout out to Edwin. They've pulled together incredible curriculum materials and resources that you can use throughout this cross-Canada exploration with your students. I hope you are using some of those before and after the event. Here's a link. I'll share this again at the end as well to the Edwin Teacher Travel Kit, where you can find all kinds of great links there. And then if you've misplaced your YouTube links, if you're joining live or afterwards to these events, you can find those there as well. Edwin also does an incredible job of sending out reminder emails with your links before the events come up. So today we are going to look at amazing species here in Canada, an icon, if you will. We're going to spend some time with Alysa McCall. She is a conservation biologist specializing in polar bears. She's based out of Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, and she spends every fall and part of every summer in Churchill, Manitoba, sometimes known as the polar bear capital of the world. She's been studying Canadian polar bears for over 7 years now, focusing largely on the Western Hudson Bay subpopulation. This is one of the first subpopulations to show the impacts of climate change. She works with Polar Bears International, supporting research and directing conservation outreach programs, all with the mission to protect the polar bear and the sea ice it calls home. So I'm going to bring Alysa in live with us right now. Hey, Alysa, how are you?
Hi, good, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Good, good. It is great to have you with us. I think I might even see a polar bear over your head
Oh,
there,
yeah.
in the
This little guy.
background.
Yeah.
So very, very cool. We are so excited to learn a little bit more about the work that you do. Our polar bear friends will play Kahoot. We'll let the students take over with questions. It's going to be a good little afternoon.
Sounds great. Yay.
All right.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining today and for being interested in polar bears. I'm going to share my screen here. So today I'm going to talk, well, of course, a little bit about what makes polar bears so cool, what I do for work, and then what you can do to help. Okay, so I'm going to start here. I think you can probably all see that. I'll move that. Cool. Okay. Like Joe said, I work for Polar Bears International. And sorry, I did recently move to the Yukon. So I was living in the Northwest Territories, and now I'm in Whitehorse in the Yukon on the traditional territory of the Kwanlin Dun First Nation and the Taquichan Council. I feel very fortunate to live in the North. I grew up in British Columbia, and now I'm, in the colder weather here, but it's really neat. There's no polar bears in Whitehorse, luckily, but as Joe did mention, I travel to go see the polar bears in different parts of Canada. So at Polar Bears International, I have a lot of different things I do for my job, but what we do as an organization, as a nonprofit organization, is we do a mixture of things, all with the goal of keeping polar bears in the Arctic. So we do research, we learn more about the bears, we do education, we teach people about the bears, we do media, we show how beautiful the bears are through photos and videos, and then we do advocacy. So that's speaking on behalf of the bears, speaking up about why they need our help and how we can help them. Polar bears are a pretty spectacular species. I think people that even will never see a polar bear in their lifetime and don't live in Canada, they still know what a polar bear is and they're attracted to the bears. They're such an incredible animal. They are the biggest bear species on the planet. So we have 8 different species of bear. We've got, the black bear and the brown bear in Canada, panda bears count in there, and then polar bears are the biggest of all. They are absolutely adapted for life on the sea ice. They are the only ocean bear or marine bear. In fact, their Latin name, Ursus maritimus, means sea bear, and that's because their life is totally tied to the presence of Arctic sea ice. Now, they can spend periods of time on land, absolutely, but if you give a polar bear a choice, 100% of the time, it would choose to be out on the ice. That's where they're adapted to live, that's their habitat, and that's because of their diet. So, the reason polar bears get so big is because of what they eat. And the number one food a polar bear likes to eat is seals, and more specifically, seal blubber or whale blubber or whatever blubber or fat they can get their paws on. We talk about polar bears being the most carnivorous of all the bear species, but we even like to call them lipovores, which means fat eaters. Because when a polar bear has its way, if it has a lot of food to eat and a lot of seals to hunt, we see polar bears strip the seals of blubber and only consume that fat, and they will leave meat and protein behind. And the other animals on the ice, like foxes and birds, they'll happily take the leftovers. But polar bears really ultimately want to eat fat, and they are so well adapted to do that. Their digestive system is very well adapted to process fat, and they cannot process proteins and carbohydrates as well as black bears or brown bears. So this is another reason that polar bears really do need ice and they need blubber, because they are just not efficient at eating fruits and berries and plants like other bear species are. So they really are this fat eating bear, which is pretty cool. And then other adaptations to live in the Arctic, of course, they've got this long, beautiful neck and head, and that shape there really helps them get in and out of seal holes. Brown bears are way blockier. They've got these really thick necks and skulls, and they wouldn't be able to get in and out of seal holes very well. But polar bears, this neck helps them get in and out and helps them swim so they can keep their head up above the water for long periods of time when they have to swim. They also see those big paws. They've got massive paws to help distribute their weight on the ice so that they don't fall through. In fact, a big polar bear can walk on very thin ice, which is pretty neat. And look at those sharp claws there, too. Those sharp claws help grab slippery seals out of the ice. They can also provide traction. And polar bears even have slightly sticky feet, just like winter tires. In fact, winter tire companies have looked at polar bear feet as a model to give more traction on ice. They really are so well suited for this life on the ice. And then just to briefly touch on moms and cubs, and I'm happy to talk about that more later if there's questions, but moms have about 1 to 3 cubs at a time, usually 1 or 2. More often now, they're having one at a time. And they will have cubs approximately every 3 years. So the cubs will stay with their mom for 2.5 years. Then they're weaned, they go off on their own, and then mom mates again and has a litter the following fall. So about every 3 years, a female is reproducing. And then the cubs, when they go off on their own at 2.5, like it's hard to be a polar bear. So between the ages of 2.5 and 5 years old, this is kind of their teenager phase. This is when they're considered a subadult. And this is one of the hardest times for a polar bear because they don't have their mom, they're not fully grown. Once they hit about 5 years old and they're an adult, then life gets a little bit easier because they're stronger and smarter. But there's these vulnerable periods in a polar bear's life that we really are looking at where they need a bit of extra help sometimes. Okay, big picture. Where do they live? You probably all know they live in the Arctic. There are no polar bears in Antarctica. We have 19 different populations spread across the Arctic, across the north. And this covers countries including Canada, Russia, Norway, Greenland, and Alaska in the US. Canada has 2/3 of the world's polar bears, so they really are a Canadian icon for very good reason. Right at the North Pole there, that is a population, but we actually don't find a lot of polar bears at the very top of the world because it's very dark and the water's not very productive, which means there's not a lot of food. So we see polar bears more over what we call the continental shelf, so the slightly shallower water around the north where there's a lot more food, more seals, more polar bears. And this is a trend map. So we do know that in parts of the polar bear's range, they are experiencing troubles already. There's a lot of parts of the range that are not well studied enough because it's so dangerous and expensive to get there. But the places where we have really good data and where we know the sea ice is changing, we know the polar bear population is changing. And you can see that here in red. And in particular, I want to call out this WH population over on the left here. That's Western Hudson Bay in Manitoba. This population, a new report just came out that shows the population has declined almost 50% since the 1980s. So from about 1,200 bears to closer to 600 bears in the last several decades. And this is because the sea ice is melting earlier and breaking up sooner. So the bears are on land longer, not getting enough food. And this doesn't mean all the bears are starving to death. What we talk about with polar bears is more or less long term, that it just gets harder to have babies and raise those babies into adulthood. That's where we see this. Usually, why we're seeing any declines is because reproduction is just getting harder when you don't have enough food to go around. But, it's not all about polar bears. Polar bears are this incredible icon of climate change and a great species to kind of talk about climate change around, because everything we do to help polar bears helps the entire food chain and ecosystem under them. They're this umbrella species at the top of the ecosystem. So polar bears need Arctic sea ice, but sea ice isn't just frozen water. Sea ice is to the ocean what soil is to a forest. So this algae, the plants of the Arctic, grow in the sea ice, just like plants grow in soil in a forest. And they feed this entire Arctic food chain all the way up, from the little creatures to the fish, to the seals, to the whales, to the bears, to the people that live across the Arctic. So when we talk about let's protect polar bears, anything we do to protect them is helping all of this, including the people that live in the Arctic and around the world, because Arctic sea ice impacts all of us. We like to call it Earth's air conditioner because of how large and white it is. It reflects sunlight really well away from the planet. And in this way, it has a cooling effect on our entire Earth. So even people that live in Australia can benefit from having Arctic sea ice. So we really do want to keep it in the Arctic for polar bears, but really for all of us. So why are we losing Arctic sea ice? Well, when we're burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas for things like heating our homes or transporting items, we're burning fossil fuels. And this is releasing carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And in regular amounts, regular carbon in the atmosphere is okay. It traps heat, but at small amounts, it's fine. But what we've done is that we've released rampant amounts of carbon dioxide with all these things we're doing. It's just a little too much now. And so we are thickening what we can think of as this heat trapping blanket around the Earth. So there's too many emissions, they can't escape our atmosphere. And so heat can escape. Heat is getting trapped around us right now. So we've got this thick blanket around Earth. And of course, ice doesn't like heat. So we're losing Arctic sea ice. But the good news is we know how we can help. We know if we did nothing at all, we could lose 2/3 of the world's polar bears by the end of the century, or most of them anyway. But we have the solutions. This is great news because when we know what the problem is, we know how to fix it. And we do know how to fix it, and we have the technology. So this is what we can do. We need to get our leaders on board. We need to shift our energy to cleaner sources like solar and wind, which we have the technology for. We just need to do it at a bigger scale. We can get a lot more efficient when we do have to burn fossil fuels. Let's do it more cleanly and more efficiently. That technology exists too. But then what we can do day to day, no matter how old we are, is talk about it. When we have these conversations with each other, we can really change societies and what is acceptable in our world. And when we're all on the same page that we all deserve a cleaner planet, then that is the direction the world will go in. And so we just encourage students to talk to each other, friends, family, teachers, ask questions, learn about where your energy comes from, how you can influence your own school and community. All of us have power, and it can often just start with talking about it. Now back to polar bears for a minute here. So I mentioned that we do a lot of research at Polar Bears International. While we're working to combat climate change and fix that, there's a lot of things we can learn about polar bears that will help us help them. This is a few of the different areas that we look at. So we work with Indigenous knowledge, the people that live with polar bears for centuries. They know so much about what's going on. It's so important we listen to them and work with them when we talk about polar bear management. We have a couple research projects looking on denning, moms and cubs, their little baby cubs. How can we protect these vulnerable dens? Genetics, where are the really important genetics to protect? Human bear interactions is a huge one. As polar bears are spending more time on land, they're coming into contact with more people. How can we keep both species safe? And then tracking polar bears. This is really important data, but we can do it a lot better than we're doing it. So here's a tracking example. If anyone's ever interested to see where some polar bears are right now in Canada, check out the polarbearsinternational.org polar bear tracker. We update it weekly with new polar bear locations. Every one of these squares is a different polar bear. You can click on the number, learn about her, see where she's going, see where she's been. It's a really neat way to follow polar bears. All of these bears on this map are collared. GPS collars are a really important tool to help us track animals, but we want to do better. We think that we can make the tracking lighter and less invasive than collars. There will always be an important place for collars, but we can also only collar adult females. Adult males have really thick necks compared to their skulls, and they pull collars right off. And we don't want to collar subadults who are growing. So we are working with 3M, the company that makes Post-it notes, and they're helping us figure out how to stick a tracker to bear's fur. And in this way, we can track any polar bear. This will fall off naturally when the bear molts. The tracker could talk to satellites and let us know where the bear is, and it would just be, less invasive on the polar bear, but still give us important data. So we're currently deploying these in the wild. Some are going out in a couple weeks again. We're refining the model, and we hope that they could also be used on other species, which would be really cool. Any animal with fur, hopefully one day could maybe hold a fur tracker, which is pretty neat. And then on the human bear interaction, so, as polar bears are spending more time on land in parts of the world, particularly in Canada and central Canada, in Ontario is a big place. Actually, we have a project with Environment Climate Change in Canada working with coastal Ontario First Nations communities that are dealing with more polar bears coming in. So we're working with them to be like, what do you need? How can we help you? What are you seeing? And we are offering a variety of different supports for the communities depending on what they want. One of the many things we're looking at is we're developing a radar system. So this is just an example. We are training a radar system with artificial intelligence, teaching it what a polar bear looks like. So this is in Churchill, Manitoba, this example here, and this radar is mounted on the school, which is right on the coast, right along a pathway along the coast here where the polar bears like to walk up. So it's a really good spot to test this radar. And basically the radar is also always scanning around, and we have to tell it, nope, that's a snowmobile. Nope, that's a bird. Nope, that's a human. Oh, that's a polar bear. This is what it looks like. And then over time, the radar will learn it, and it will be able to alert people when it sees a polar bear coming in. And if it can give people a lot more warning, we're more likely to have a better encounter or no encounter. So people can get inside, get safe, let the polar bear go, or help the polar bear move along. Fewer people get hurt. And this is just a quick example. So you'll see the movements of the camera here. That's just the camera driving itself. There's no one driving the camera at all, but it's alerted us that it sees a polar bear on the tundra. It's let us know so we can log into the computer. Oh yeah, there's a bear. And then let it go on its way while we stay safe. Other examples of staying safe in polar bear country: bear-proof garbage bins, bear spray, flares, bangers. There's a lot of things we're helping provide to communities to keep everyone safe. And then for kids, so for little kids that live with polar bears, it's important that they are polar bear aware even when they're playing outside on their playground. So we've developed a series of coloring books for Greenland, Russia, parts of Canada, where we can, in a non-threatening way, teach kids how to play with polar bears. So this is just an example. So that's just to give you any idea of what it might be like living in a different part. Luckily in Toronto, there's no polar bears, but not that far away from you, people do have to deal with that. So polar bears are an incredible species for many different reasons. We think they are very worth conserving, worth keeping in the Arctic, and we know we can do it if we work together. And the great news is that everything we do for polar bears, we do for ourselves. And so maybe, Joe, if you don't mind playing that short YouTube video, it's about 2 minutes, and then we'll wrap up, and I'm excited to take any questions you might have.
Future generations of people and polar bears depend on the decisions and plans that we make today. A polar bear's life cycle is almost exclusively tied to the sea ice. Because polar bears rely on sea ice to hunt, to breed, and sometimes to den, sea ice loss from climate change is their biggest threat, and the reason the bears are listed as vulnerable on the IUCN's Red List of Threatened Species. What we learn about climate change impacts on polar bears in Hudson Bay can be applied across the Arctic to help conserve other populations. Climate change is already affecting some populations of polar bears. Since we get most of our energy from fossil fuels, we are producing huge amounts of carbon dioxide. You see, regular amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere act like a blanket around the Earth, trapping heat and keeping our planet at a stable temperature. However, when we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas for energy, we pump rampant amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This buildup thickens the blanket, trapping too much heat, disrupting the climate, and melting Arctic sea ice. When Arctic waters are cold enough, the top layer freezes into a special type of ice called sea ice. Sea ice is to the ocean what soil is to a forest. It supports the entire Arctic food chain. Food from this marine ecosystem also sustains northern communities. The key to getting the climate back to functioning the way it should, and to preserving a future for polar bears across the Arctic, is to move away from using fossil fuels for energy altogether. The most important thing we can do is vote with the climate in mind to let our leaders know we support a swift transition to renewable energy sources. In the meantime, we can directly participate in and learn more about our local and regional renewable energy options. We can all make a difference outside our own households by influencing where our energy comes from. Because together, we can make sure that polar bears roam the Arctic sea ice for generations to come.
Great. Thanks, Joe. So that basically just summarizes my talk there, but I think it's nice to have a little repeat at the end. So again, thank you so much for your interest in polar bears. I'm happy to take questions on any aspect of their research or biology. Yeah, thanks, Joe.
All right, Alysa, thank you so much for that great presentation. And something that really kind of resonated in that video was that the sea ice to the Arctic is like the forest to the soil. It's so important, plays such an important role in the ecosystem, as habitat, as places for food to cling to and grow at the lower end of the food chain. I think that's a really good way to put it, how important the sea ice is to that ecosystem. So what we're going to do now is we're going to play a little Kahoot together. So our students should know all about our Kahoot action. I'm going to share my screen here. I've also put the Kahoot information in the chat. But if you head over here to kahoot.it and then put in this PIN number it's going to ask for, 415-7062, it will bring you in. If you've got the one-to-one at your desk, great. You can join right there. If not, your teacher can put it up at the front of the room. You can shout out your answers to him or her. If you're virtual and you've got a tablet or a phone handy, you could scan that QR code and it'll bring you right into your spot. I believe there's 5 questions for today, some true and false, some multiple choice. If you get that answer right, you're getting some points. You've got 20 seconds to get each answer in. The faster you put in that correct answer, the more points you're going to get. If you slam in the answer in a second and it's wrong, well, we got nothing for you. So you do have to take a minute and listen to the question and make sure that you get it in. I see tons of students joining, which is great. We've got the charming gecko, the eager octopus, the legend hamster. So we've got our auto-generated animals coming in, which is really cool. While we do wait, because there's lots joining, Alysa, let's get a couple questions here. So this first question here in the chat is wondering about polar bears fighting for territory. Do they do that?
Great question. They don't. So other animals that are territorial, they are usually land animals, and there's very specific boundaries in which they can defend. But because polar bears live on the sea ice is always shifting and moving, and it never looks the same even hour to hour. So it would be physically impossible to try to defend a territory. So polar bears really are not territorial, which is a neat fact.
Okay, here's a grade 8 question. Looks like from Miss Jacob's crew, and they're wondering, when you look at a picture of a polar bear, it looks like their eyes are all black. Is that any special purpose or adaptation?
We don't think so. It probably helps them on the really bright Arctic sea ice. If they had really light eyes, it might be a bit too much for them. So the dark eyes probably do help because it gets really bright out there when the sun's up, reflecting on all the white. Polar bears do have something called a nictitating membrane. So it's that third eyelid that can go across their eyes. I think cats might have it too. And we think that can also help them with the too much sun and when they swim underwater. So they do have neat eyes.
Okay, well, things are slowing down, so I think we're safe to get things started. We've also got Miss Zambry's crew hanging out backstage, so we're going to bring them in live to ask some questions on camera for us shortly. But let's get right into our Kahoot. Here we go. A reminder that there are 5 questions. There's some true and false. There's some multiple choice. You have 20 seconds for each question. If you were paying attention, you should be ready to rock and roll. So let's see what happens. Counting us in with a 3-second countdown to our polar bear quiz. And we are off. So a true and false to start. Polar bear scientific name means ice bear. True or false? The polar bear scientific name means ice bear. I mean, that sounds legit. The picture looks like it's on ice. Is that what a polar bear scientific name means? Is it ice bear? Oh, we did trick a good number of students. If you were listening right at the beginning, it's marine bear. That's sea ice out on the ocean. And they can actually swim amazing distances as well, Alysa. Isn't that true?
Yeah, they can. If they have to, they can swim hundreds of kilometers at a time. They'd rather not, but they can if they need to. Yeah.
All right. So marine bear and not, in fact, ice bear. Agent Panda wasn't fooled, though. Agent Panda is holding down that top spot. And I think they got the max number of points, so they must have hit that answer pretty fast. So let's go to our next question. What's a polar bear's favorite type of food? Is it fat? Is it carbs? Is it sugar? Or is it protein? Is it fat? Is it carbs? Is it sugar? Is it protein? Remember, Alysa talked about if they had the chance. When eating something like a seal, there's one part that they would just eat if food was plentiful. All right, there we go. We've redeemed ourselves with fat, blubber. They love, and we'll strip that off if they can, if that's available to them. The royal ostrich has taken that top spot. Let's go to our next question. How many polar bear populations are there? Are there 5 around the world? 19, 23, or 10? This polar bear here in this picture looks like it's thinking about that answer. Is it 5? Is it 19? Is it 23? Or is it 10 populations of polar bears around the world? Okay, a little spread out, but most students did go with 19, which is absolutely correct. Very cool. And I think there's if you look up online, I think there's a great map that kind of shows the different areas as well.
Totally. Cool.
Royal ostrich is holding on strong. We've got another question coming up. Why are polar bears losing their habitat? Is it, spelling mistake, too much plastic? Are we burning too much fossil fuel? Are cows farting too much? Or are we cutting down their forests? Why are polar bears losing their habitat? Plastics, fossil fuels, cows farting, or cutting down their forests? Nailed it. Absolutely. Nice. Fossil fuels. Now, sure, cows do release a little bit of methane, but I have a feeling it's not quite as impactful as the fossil fuel that we are burning. We know they don't really use those forests. That sea ice is so darn important to them. And then, plastics is a reality that the plastics are found everywhere, even in the sea ice, in the air, in snow. Plastics are spreading all over our planet.
Yeah.
And for those students who don't know, plastics are made using oil in a lot of cases. So, all right. Royal ostrich might hold on till the end. Let's see with our 5th question. Polar bears are an umbrella species. This means that if we protect them, We hurt species like seals. We keep species from getting wet. We protect lots of other species, or it just really doesn't make a difference whether we protect them or not. So are we hurting seals? Are we keeping species dry? Are we protecting lots? Or does it really not make a difference? All right, good job, crew. Umbrella species, we protect them, and we are protecting so many other species. All right, let's take a look at our podium. Third place, we have the clever pigeon. In second place, we've got the amusing hare. And what happened with that coveted top spot? The royal ostrich was able to hold on. All right. Very, very cool. I will share this link as well with the YouTube link to all the classrooms, so you can tune in later. You can play the Kahoot again if you want to as well. Okay, let's kill that screen share and let's move full on into some Q&A action. All right. So I see we have lots of questions coming in via the chat. We'll get to some of those in a second. But first, I want to bring in Miss Ambry's crew. Let's bring them in here. Looks like there's some grade 7s.
If we do make the changes that you were talking about, how long will it take to increase the polar bear population?
All right. So he was saying if we make those changes that you talked about, less fossil fuels and such, how long before that kind of has an impact and we see numbers going up again?
That's a great question. That's really something that a lot of researchers are looking at right now. We do know there's some heat kind of baked into the system. So if we made a lot of changes right now, we're still going to see some declines in polar bears for a little while. But we know if we can keep warming to about 2 degrees, we can keep polar bears in the Arctic indefinitely forever. Whereas, of course, if we did nothing at all, we could lose most of them by the end of the century. So there's not an exact timeline, but we know sea ice also doesn't seem to have a tipping point. So there's no point at which we've lost sea ice forever. We know we can get it back if we make the changes, which is really good news. But it's a great question. It's one many people are looking at.
All right. Let's see if there's one more there, and then we'll take a few more from YouTube. So don't be shy. Get some questions in via YouTube.
If we don't do anything about it, when are polar bears going to go extinct?
Okay. If we do nothing, Alysa, are we going to lose polar bears? How much time do we have?
Yeah, if we did nothing at all to change our current path, we would lose most of the world's polar bears by about 2100. We'd still have some up in the high Arctic, but if we just kept going as normal, we would eventually lose those as well. At that point, though, our world would have changed so much that humans, we'd be a lot more worried about ourselves. And at that point, we wouldn't really have resources to worry about the polar bears. So, but yeah, we want to make the changes for us and for them.
All right, Miss Ambry's crew, we'll come check in a few moments after we grab a few more YouTube questions. But I think that is such a good point, is we always ask, how much time do we have? How much time do we have? But when it gets to that situation where we are losing, that much sea ice and habitats around the world, we are going to be in so much trouble by that stage that we shouldn't be thinking about that. We should be thinking about what we're doing right now before we get to that kind of dire stage.
Exactly. It's not too late yet, so we shouldn't wait till it is.
All right. Mrs. McLaughlin's fourth graders are with us, and they want to know, have you ever come across an injured polar bear?
We have. So polar bears, especially male polar bears, it's a hard life out there on the sea ice, and male polar bears fight each other for mates. And so we have seen some pretty gnarly injuries over the years. A lot of times polar bears can heal very well, though, because their environment is quite sterile with the cold and the salty water. In fact, there's a polar bear up near the Churchill area that we've seen off and on, and he's only got 3 paws. He lost a paw somehow. So he's a tripod bear, but it's healed. He's doing fine. We also see some pretty crazy scars that have healed up pretty well. One of the worst injuries a polar bear can get is in its teeth. If it breaks its teeth, then it's harder to eat and hunt, and that can't heal as well, obviously, as body scars. So yeah, but they have a rough life out there.
All right. So grade 7s here are wondering about, we know there's positive effects, obviously, to protecting polar bears. Are there any negatives or downsides to protecting polar bears?
I don't know if I've ever been asked that question. I That's a great point. I mean, I think some people might say that, they feel like to protect polar bears, we have to give stuff up, and people don't want to give things up right now. Our conveniences are a way of life, sort of thing. So I think some folks look at that as a negative. They think they have to stop eating meat, or they can't drive their vehicle, or they will be shamed for buying something plastic. And that's not what we're about at all. So we really think this big picture of keeping polar bears in the Arctic, meaning keeping their ice habitat in the Arctic, there's really no downsides if it keeps our Earth functioning well and healthily, and keeps us with, a stable planet as well, and stable climate systems. So big picture, no. Short term, I also think no. We've got all these technologies that, we don't have to really lose any modern conveniences. We just need to be smarter about it, about what we're doing. But yeah, good. Maybe the seals would disagree, but the seals also need the ice habitat. So, they both need the same home. I'm sure they don't want to see more polar bears, though.
Yeah, it's interesting because some people might even say, "Oh, well, what about, bear-human conflict?"
Mm-hmm.
But I
True.
mean, indigenous populations throughout the Arctic have been coexisting with polar bears for, a long time.
Forever.
So,
Absolutely.
because we're pushing into their territory, doesn't mean that they should lose some of that territory. So,
Absolutely. And we fully support northern communities handling polar bears how they need to keep themselves safe. So we do want to ultimately keep polar bears in the wild for them to coexist with polar bears traditionally as well. And they can deal with things how they need to, and we support them in that. So, yeah, great question. Philosophical one.
okay. So grade 6s, Miss Sadler's crew are wondering, polar bears, maybe the baby ones, maybe the adult ones. Do you've observed them. Does it ever look like they're doing anything for fun?
Totally. So mom gives birth in the dens, and she nurses her cubs in her den for a few months. They're born just itty bitty, and they grow really fast because mom's milk is really rich. And when they break out of their den, mom is so hungry. She has not been eating for almost 8 months at this time. So she would love to just get to the ice and eat. But first, what she needs to do is let her cubs play, because when they get to play outside, they get to exercise their muscles, they get used to their legs. And so mom will take time where she'd rather be eating and let her cubs play for maybe a week, or sometimes even a little bit more, before they'll head to the sea ice. So we definitely see them rough and tumble. We see even older cubs playing with each other. It's a good way to just learn how to be a polar bear through play. Yeah, it's pretty fun.
All right, very cool. Miss Danbury's crew, if you have another question there, turn on your camera for us. That'll be my cue to come back. We do have a few more here on YouTube as well, so keep those coming, but let's go back. Let's get some faces up here. I missed a little bit of that, Bud. Was it about the trackers? How do you put the trackers on them?
Without getting hurt.
Okay. So how do you get the trackers on them without getting hurt?
Great question, which I did not go into. So when the trackers are put on the bears, that's part of existing research programs we have on polar bears. So a couple times a year in certain populations, not all of them, we do hands-on field work. And so that does mean finding polar bears via helicopter and tranquilizing them. And then when they're sleeping, we make sure they're breathing well and their vitals are good, and then we will do our research. So we'll attach a tracker, we'll check their teeth, we'll measure them, we'll see how healthy they are, we'll take all our notes, all our data down for later, make sure the bear's good to go, and then we hop back in the helicopter and let the bear wake up. So it's part of these research programs where the bear does sleep for about an hour while we do what we need to do. We definitely don't want to put a tracker on if the bear is not nicely sleeping.
All right. Great question. Do we have another one there?
Okay, wait. Have you guys ever had like a dangerous encounter with a polar bear?
All right. So, Alysa, have you, or maybe people you've worked with in the community of Churchill, ever had like a dangerous encounter or a close encounter?
It definitely does happen. I've been lucky enough. I've had encounters, but I was fine. The bear wasn't that interested in me and walked away. We have had a couple staff members who've been working in the field and had a bear, quite aggressive, trying to get at them, approach them, and they ended up using bear spray, which is very effective on polar bears, and the bear went away. And then people in the town of Churchill, most people that have lived there for a while have a story or two to tell you about an encounter. And in 2013, there were a few polar bear attacks on people in Canada. So it does happen. It is pretty rare. And when we are working in the field, we have all the safety gear we can. And one of the best safety things too is to have a bear monitor. So whenever we're doing research or anything in the field, there's one person and their only job is just to look for polar bears. They are not doing anything else. They're just looking like this all day long for bears to warn everyone if one comes in. So a lot of safety measures, but yeah, so far we've been lucky.
All right,
And
grade
prepared.
sevens. Thanks for those great questions. So I have a friend, his name is Paul Rose, and he does a lot of expeditions in the Arctic, the Antarctic polar regions. And he had an encounter once where they were sleeping on the ice in their tents. And his wake up in the morning was a polar bear's front feet coming right through the tent.
Oh my goodness.
And I think the sound he made and the polar bear just being confused in general, he was okay. The polar bear kind of wandered off, but that would be quite the morning wake up call.
No kidding. I will say there is a myth out there that polar bears are like the only man hunters or something like that. They're not really, but they're highly curious and they're hungry. So they will approach people. But most of us that are in the bear world would rather encounter a polar bear than an angry grizzly bear any day of the week. They're generally a little less aggressive, but some can be. And yeah, if I woke up in the morning with a polar bear coming through my tent, whew, I'd be a little spooked.
All right. Let's take a few more questions here from the chat. So this has come in a few times from some grade sevens as well as some grade fours. The life expectancy. How long will a polar bear live in the wild?
Yeah, great question. So males usually can live into like their late teens, maybe early 20s. Females live a little longer because they're not fighting with each other so much. So they can live into their early mid 20s, maybe a little longer than that, depending on the bear. And then the record for the oldest polar bear we know about was a bear in captivity. Her name was Debbie, and she lived at the Assiniboine Park Zoo in Winnipeg, and she lived till 42 years old. It's the oldest bear we know of. Yeah.
So Miss Williams, sixth graders, this might be a tough question to answer, but they want to know, do polar bears have any weaknesses or maybe like bad behaviors or habits?
Oh, so some bears, when we talk about habits, if a bear has a bad habit, often it was learned from its mom. So in Churchill, Manitoba, they used to have an outdoor garbage dump and bears would come eat there. They then moved the dump inside now, but cubs that were taught by their mom to go look for garbage, they really kept those behaviors. And well into adulthood, some of those bears were coming back to town again and again looking for garbage. That's one of the reasons why we've helped fund polar bear proof garbage bins in Churchill, just so there's no rewards given. So they will do that. Some bears are more aggressive than others. There's a genetic study actually looking at that right now. Some just inherently are more likely to try to break into a cabin for food than others would be. So that does happen. And then weaknesses, a kind of a different angle here, but if a polar bear does attack or something, then we always tell people, punch its nose, punch its eyes. And I think one interesting fact about polar bears too is because their diet is mainly fat and squishy seals, they have weaker jaws than brown bears, than grizzly bears. So grizzly bears actually have a harder bite than polar bears do, just because grizzlies are like crunching all the time and polar bears aren't. So there's a few facts wrapped into one answer there.
All right. Very cool. Well, before we wrap up for today, these have been great questions. So obviously a shout out to our students. Thank you for playing Kahoot. Thank you for sending in so many great questions. I do want to remind everybody that we are going to be back in action for stop number 4. We're going to head to the Arctic with Kasif Miranda, and he's going to share some of his amazing experiences diving in the Arctic. So he's studying seaweed and kelps in the Arctic, which are important parts of the ecosystem. So he suits up, jumps into that cold water, and gets to explore an amazing underwater world that not a lot of people get to see. So that is April 12th at 9:15 a.m. Eastern. And I want to remind everybody as well, particularly our educators, to use those Edwin teacher travel kits. You can find an easy link there, but you'll also have been sent the link multiple times as well to your email, so you can find that there. Alysa, thank you so much for being with us today. We need to keep our cold parts of the planet. They are so important. And I think back to a story that it's not just us, or it's not just polar bears or Arctic animals. It's us who like the cold as well. We hosted an elder up in the Northwest Territories. His name was George, and he was telling us stories of his youth and moving around and how he remembers the cold. And while he was telling us these stories, there was a big snowstorm going on in the background. And we had a classroom in Mexico joining us. And so when they asked him some questions, they took their camera outside to show him the heat and the palm trees. And George kind of looked at it and shook his head and goes, no, you keep that heat. The cold is home. So we need the cold to be home for Indigenous peoples, and we need the cold to be home for our polar bears and all of the Arctic animals that call the cold home. So Alysa, thank you so much for the work you're doing with Polar Bears International, your whole team, and making sure that we get that word out there that we need to have that cold future for us, not just the polar bears.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Joe. Thanks for helping us talk about the bears, and having a platform for people to talk about all the great things they're doing. And thanks for everyone's questions today. Really great questions. Think about some of those.
All right, Toronto Catholic District School Board, thanks so much for being with us today. We are going to sign off for now, and we'll see everybody on our fourth stop on the 12th. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.